Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm Deepak, joining you from India and excited to host today's episode. It's true pleasure to have Liz Paushter joins us as our distinguished guest on today's episode. Liz Paushter serves as the Executive Director, Badavas Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning at Bentley University. She leads initiatives that redefine how teaching and learning and engagement evolves across campus. With more than 2 decades of experience in education, she champions faculty development, interdisciplinary collaboration, and the transformative power of meaningful learning. As a strategic partner to faculty and academic leaders, Liz cultivates a culture of curiosity, experimentation, and continuous growth, guiding the center's work in pedagogy, instructional design, emerging technologies, and faculty learning communities, all anchored in a deep commitment to equity, evidence, and lasting impact. A recognized voice in play-based learning, experiential education, and inclusive pedagogy, Liz regularly shares her insights at national conferences and through contributions to the field of academic innovation. Currently pursuing her doctorate in education in transformational education and organizational leadership at Northeastern University. She explores how universities can design more human-centered and future-ready learning ecosystems that empower both educators and students. Today, Liz Poscher joins us to discuss her fascinating work, play-based learning and faculty development, transforming teaching excellence. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Liz Poscher to the podcast. Liz, we deeply appreciate your gracious acceptance of our invitation. It's an honor and privilege to host you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Liz, what first drew you to explore play-based learning as a strategy for faculty development and how has it evolved in your work at the Badavas Center?
Mm. About 15 years ago, I was in a department meeting and faculty were expressing serious concern about how students have an intense fear of failure. And I'm sure you've heard a lot about that. And no matter how much the faculty say to students that they value iteration and experimentation, there's still this really fear of failure. And one faculty member said, "Well, how are we any different?" And that sparked a conversation about, what are we really modeling for our students? And at the same time, I noticed that only 3 to 4 faculty were really engaging in the conversation of maybe a department of about 10. So I asked if they would indulge me, and I asked them to stand up for a moment. And I ran through a number game, which was where they had to count with a partner really quickly, and then I kept throwing these constraints at them. And it got really wild. And within a minute, faculty were laughing, they were messing up, they were celebrating the moments that they failed. And it actually took me a lot longer to settle them down than it did the actual exercise that I had them do. And so when we were debriefing that conversation and really talking about that joy and the laughter and the celebration of failure that they were experiencing, that helped them reframe the concept. It helped them come up with some really great ideas on how to normalize failure with their students. And so it was really kind of a moment for me where I was like, we can bring joy and play and fun into spaces to get us thinking more deeply and more creatively on how to connect with each other or solve a problem. And there really is, I think, no better way to connect than through playfulness, which really is both a mindset and a behavior. And so we can talk about the billion reasons why, and really why and how it's embedded into the science of learning. But when I got deeply involved in faculty development, I really started to come at it from that playful, human-centered, community-focused mindset and really asked myself, like, how can what we know about learning science be applied to faculty development? And so that's really where it started. And when I think about what brings me the most joy in my career, it's when I get a bunch of really smart faculty and teachers in one space around a shared purpose, doing fun teaching explorations and experiments. And it's that, creativity and the curiosity and the ideation that follows.
In what ways does play, often associated with childhood, unlock creativity, innovation, and reflection in adult learning? especially among university faculty?
Yeah, I think we can't talk about creativity and innovation without talking about curiosity. And so curiosity is really at the heart of play. And research across learning science and adult development shows that curiosity really increases everything from attention to persistence to trying new things, right? To memory formation. And so playful environments naturally activate curiosity because they combine the uncertainty with psychological safety of being in a community that you feel connected to. And so Greg McGowan actually writes in his book called Essentialism that play expands the mind that allows us to explore. And that it really, I think he uses the word germinate, which I like. It germinates new ideas and brings new ideas to light that maybe weren't there before. And so, really, what we see is that play is not separate from adult learning theory. Adult learning theory tells us that adults learn best when learning is self-directed, when it's relevant, when it's experiential, and when it's socially constructed. And so play really, I'd say, activates all of that in those conditions. When we think about andragogy, which is adult learning, the adults are really motivated when things are attached to the real world, right? And in that when there's autonomy in their learning. And play introduces agency. It does. Like participants have to make decisions or test ideas when they're playing. They shape the learning experience rather than just like passively receiving the information. Or when we think about experiential learning theory, which is so deeply part of my work, that really emphasizes learning through cycles of experience and then reflection and experimentation, and play creates those experiences that really kind of fuels that cycle, and makes meaning out of any sort of future action that faculty might take. And I also think that the research on curiosity and intrinsic motivation, that sort of self-determination shows up a lot with play as well, because play with faculty development, you're creating environments that are really intentional about those conditions. And they often lead to that deeper creativity and experimentation, and innovation. So I think we really need to bust the myth that play is for adolescents. It's really not separate from adult learning as, in addition, and kind of operationalizes a lot of adult learning.
Please, can you share an example of how experiential or play-based approaches have tangibly improved teaching practices or student engagement on campus?
Yeah. So there's a lot of examples I could share. I'll also share that. So this is the third year that we have run a faculty learning community as community of practice that's interdisciplinary. So members of all departments are really involved, which is really is key. But we call it Pedagogy Unleashed. And we have a number of different communities that have different pedagogical focuses. Like, for instance, we have AI in pedagogy, or one that's focused on transdisciplinary education. But this one, Pedagogy Unleashed, is focused on play-based education. And it's a community that meets regularly. And this year is much more robust. So we're creating a playbook, we're doing studies, creating some data. But I have in the past surveyed faculty participants, and 100% of those surveyed have reported that their time in the play-based community made them feel more connected to peers, more exploratory with teaching practice, more creative and curious with their own pedagogy, and much more confident in the classroom. And some of those faculty even did mini studies in their classes. so surveying their students before and after play-based activities, and their reports mirror the same experience that the faculty have in the community. So students find joy in the community and the connection, but also on a cognitive level. So we have seen that students, for instance, understand a concept more deeply by engaging in play than they do when they don't engage in some play. And so there's this cognitive impact, but there's also this cultural impact. In fact, I was in a meeting yesterday about teaching effectiveness and how we're measuring teaching effectiveness. And a tenured professor who's also an associate dean had been in the Unleashed cohort 2 years ago. And he works closely with a number of programs that I work on too. And he said in this meeting, he voiced the importance of maintaining and continuing to build joy in teaching and in faculty communities. And so to hear him prioritize joy, which is so tied to play, shows how impactful he's seeing that on a very cultural level. And so examples of things like this, like from tiny to big, right? In terms of how it's actually implemented. But on a small scale, in addition to the number game I mentioned, I've done this with faculty and then I've watched faculty do it with students, which is actually an improv game. It's called Tableau. It's a freeze frame, like a physical freeze frame. And so in small groups, for instance, give a group an index card with a topic. And so if you are in a class that maybe you have a really complex topic and you're like, I don't know how to get them to really understand this topic. So put that topic on an index card. Give those topics, a variety of topics to the groups. For me, with faculty, it might have something to do with pedagogy, right? So an easy example would be student engagement. So maybe I'd give them a card that says something like an engaged class. And I give the groups 1 minute to decide how, as a team, they're going to physically freeze and represent an engaged classroom. So then we take turns tableauing. They do their freeze and they're very silly and they're kind of had to come up with something. Um, and then as a full group, we have a conversation on what an engaged classroom looks like. So they freeze, we look at them, we say, here's what I see, here's what I see, here's what I see. But what's happened is that we've made the thinking visible, which research shows it's a method for learning. And so it's not just about joy and laughter and group connections, but what we see is that it forces the group, so in my case, faculty, to have to think deeply about a topic at its core and represent it in a new way, right? So it's a lot of cognitive work in addition to the emotive work. And we've done similar things with Lego, for instance, on a complex topic where they have to build a representation of that topic, which really makes them have to think really deeply about it.
What challenges do you encounter when introducing play-based or experiential learning concepts in academic settings that traditionally value structure and rigor?
Yes. The biggest challenge is the misconception that play reduces rigor, when in fact, research really distinguishes the traditional definition of rigor, which is often around workload, like you're rigorous if it's a hard class because you do a lot of work, right? From cognitive rigor, which is really about those higher order thinking skills. And so playful learning actually increases analysis, transfer, problem solving, right? So, in other words, if we can debunk what rigor really means, which is getting those students those higher order thinking skills and not just giving them more workload, that certainly helps solve that challenge. I think another challenge is cultural. Higher education often rewards expertise and certainty, while innovation requires a lot of visible experimentation and occasional, failure, quote unquote failure. And so our work on reframing experimentation as a scholarly teaching practice is important, like grounded in evidence and reflection. I think really helps faculty see something like play or joy-based pedagogy as a method for strengthening rigor rather than replacing it.
How do faculty learning communities serve as a spaces for experimentation and risk taking? and what role
Yeah.
does curiosity play in sustaining their success?
hmm So faculty learning communities, I think, are my favorite thing to build. And a lot of that is because they are, one, it's a sustained model. And often in traditional teaching and learning centers, traditionally they are consultation models, right? Where a faculty might have an issue in class and they're like, I need some help. And they come to a learning designer or a pedagogical expert and they get that help and then they go back and they do it in their classroom. And that's great. And that's super important. However, faculty learning communities are a sustainable, scalable model that create this sense of psychological safety to try and experiment with others, um, get ideas, reflect and review what worked and didn't. And it really becomes a space for risk taking. And that then inspires faculty to create more courses or spaces in their own classes for risk taking, which I really think is very important. Um, Nicola Whitten wrote a book called Play and Learning in Adulthood, I believe, and she talks about how the creation of playful spaces in adult spaces enables the development of supportive learning communities and where we can learn from failure. And so she really looks at that idea of community as like iteration and playing with failure. And so they really do create that psychological safety. And the research really does demonstrate that when individuals feel safe taking risks and interpersonal risks in particular, that learning behaviors as like experimentation and help seeking really increases. And I think that curiosity is what sustains the communities. So faculty come to not just learn ideas, but to investigate their own teaching, to share results and iterate collectively and go through that cycle of experimentation and reflection and community feedback. And so we see those certainly in all of our faculty learning communities. And honestly, when we play together, we learn together. And so that becomes really strong experimentation.
How can interdisciplinary collaboration amplify the impact of pedagogical innovation and help build a shared culture of teaching excellence?
Hmm. Yeah, the interdisciplinary approach and the play-based approach are really the winning combo. So, empirical research on interdisciplinary learning largely focuses on the outcomes of like academic disciplinary or discipline engagement, meaning students show a deeper engagement with multiple disciplines if it's coming from interdisciplinary angle or metacognitive skills. So students gain self-regulation and reflective thinking and certain learning strategies or perspective taking, right? That enhances the ability to understand and appreciate diverse viewpoints. And so play, as we've said, does all of those things as well. So you put those together and you get faculty or students, right, depending on their context, um, learning from each other, finding new perspectives, thinking about their own practice and their own thinking. And I'd say many real world challenges are wicked problems, and that's not a term that I've coined. But that the wicked problems are complex issues that really require multiple disciplines and disciplinary perspectives in order to address it, right? And they're often really unsolvable in some ways. So interdisciplinary collaboration really encourages the integration, I'd say, of different problems into problem solve, which really is linked to those higher order thinking skills I was mentioning. And maybe this idea of being adaptive, which we know from workforce demands, like they need students to be graduating and be flexible and adaptive, right? And so that really fosters it as well. And I think when faculty collaborate across disciplines in something like course design and in these faculty learning communities, they model for students how knowledge systems interact and how you're better prepared for the complex problem solving that's really required in today's economy. And we know that a lot of we used to call them durable skills, but really they're these transformational skills, right? We know that the workforce is demanding them now more than ever because as technology changes and emerges, it's not about really knowing the tech tool, right? It's about having the skills to be able to change with it, to solve the problems, to have grit, to be able to think critically. That critical thinking skill is so important. And so the interdisciplinary world and the play world coming together allows for all of those skills to really be fostered.
Liz, in your experience, what are the some key indicators or metrics that demonstrate the success of faculty development initiatives grounded in play and experience?
Mm. Well, first, it's interest, right? I mean, we look at behavioral and cultural indicators as part of this, are part of our metrics. And one is for faculty participation. And you can feel the energy when faculty get into groups together in a community of practice around a shared purpose. And it really is contagious. And so I think the interest and the continued interest and enthusiasm around it is one indicator. We also look at teaching innovations moving, right? From idea to pilot to a scaled implementation. And so if those are moving and those are successful, then that's a great indicator that our approach is working. And we very much are, we have at Bentley, we have a new academic innovation initiative across campus called the Technology Innovation and Entrepreneurship Initiative. We call it TIE. And that has a strategic plan, and we have metrics for that. And what we really are looking for is experiential learning being a foundation for that and being able to measure the success of how experiential learning impacts students' skills, like those durable skills I was just talking about. And so we partner with industry partners, for instance, to ensure that those skills are being applicable into spaces outside of Bentley. Um, and so we are documenting our course redesigns and our experimentations and our reflections. We monitor the institutional indicators like more collaborative teaching initiatives. We have team teaching initiatives, for instance, stronger innovation pipelines. We're putting a lot of structures in place. This cohort model. So we have the faculty learning communities, but we have faculty cohorts all over the university. So from our pre-Bentley program, for instance, we have a faculty cohort who teaches that all the way to our professional MBA program. We're cohorting those faculty, right? And so we're seeing, and we're working with those faculty to see how, by being in a cohort, how that's impacting the way that they feel connected themselves and then how they teach. So, number of different ways like that.
How does your own leadership philosophy, particularly around professional growth and reflection, influence the programs and culture you have built at Bentley University?
Mm. I think it's interesting. One of my colleagues and friends recently told me that they see my leadership as relational leader. And I never thought about it that way, but I completely agree. I value connection. I value community. I know through learning science that the more we feel connected to each other, the better we will achieve in our own spaces. So whether that is student outcomes in the classroom or whether it is in my own job, if I feel connected, then I do a better job, right? And so my leadership philosophy is really grounded in the idea of professional growth happens through connection, through experience, reflection, the social learning, the community learning, which really is supported by that experiential learning theory. And so I design faculty development environments that prioritize that connection and that joy, really largely because the research consistently shows that that belonging and psychological safety increases professional engagement and willingness to innovate. And so I never underestimate the power of joy and fun, and not just for fun's sake, although sometimes there's nothing wrong with that. But we all want to enjoy what we do and who we do it with. And so why not lessen the stress and be deliberate about creating spaces for joy that really help people unite over shared purposes.
What role does technology play in shaping the culture of play-based and experiential learning? And how can it be integrated without losing the human connection?
Mm. So before I was in this space, I was part of academic technology in other schools, and so it's a real important connection as we move forward in our lives to be thinking about how does technology enhance or expand, right? And to not but to always put pedagogy first. So technology should enhance perhaps, but not replace. And I think technology expands the range of experiential learning possibilities, right? So, like simulations, collaborative platforms, AI supported feedback. But research does also, I would say, consistently show that learning outcomes depend more on the pedagogy than on the technology themselves. So we therefore we begin with learning goals, right? And cognitive processes. So what kinds of thinking we want students to engage in, for example, and then select the tools that support things like active learning and collaboration and reflection. And so when used intentionally, the technology really enhances experiential learning without replacing the human relationships that we know are so important and that really make learning meaningful. And I do follow a real oldie but goodie model called the Sammer model, which asks us to think deeply about how technology enhances learning experiences and higher order thinking skills. So, has us ask these questions of, does the technology just substitute or augment what we're trying to do, or does it actually modify and redefine our work? And so in our academic innovation initiative at Bentley, we're really working on figuring out the redefinition part, right? So for instance, how does VR show up to be such a positive tool for student learning that maybe we couldn't have before? And we have incredible faculty who are building research and programs and curriculum around it. And I'll give you a quick example. So Dr. Betsy Stoner, you should look up her work. She's a marine ecologist, and she was interested in having her students study a number of, the topics that she does in her class and get underwater. And so in the past, she has taken students to the Bahamas, and she still does. But she was worried about accessibility and inclusivity with that. And so she decided to take, because not every student can afford to do that. And so she decided to take one of our videographers down to the Bahamas with her, and they filmed and created a VR experience and narrated it and the whole thing. And it's now an open educational resource, but she did a study with it, and she found that the students who used the VR did just as well or even better in some cases with the content than those who went down underwater. In real life. And so, there are moments like that that we can point to how technology can redefine our learning experiences if done intentionally and with the pedagogy first. And I'll mention that when she rolled out her VR work, she was sure to work with us on creating a learning experience around it, not just put it out there as a thing to do, right? Because we want to be really intentional about what's the learner experience. How are they thinking? How are they building their knowledge? What's the scaffolding look like? What are they doing with it, right? And so to take a real pedagogical approach with that experiential learning is key.
Please, before we close, there is one last question I would like to ask you. Looking ahead, how do you envision universities designing more human-centered, adaptive, and joyful models of learning for both educators and students?
Mm. I think an approach like play-based learning is just one tool in the toolbox. The human-centered learning, I hope, continues to become sort of the vessel of the toolbox, right? That we need connection to see each other as value add to our lives and to our work. So a human-centered approach in itself can carry so much joy and such strong outcomes of our work. I hope that play and the pedagogy of play and of joy will be recognized more as a serious pedagogical strategy in the classroom, but also in the workforce, as we've talked about, because it supports the curiosity, the resilience, the innovation, right? Skills required for navigating the complex global challenges and problems that we encounter. And I think even more importantly, or just as importantly, we should not underestimate the power of that fun, that environments that foster enjoyment and connection continue to increase the creativity and persistence, that motivation, right? And willingness to take the intellectual risks that we should be taking, and therefore ultimately strengthens whatever outcomes we're looking for. And I know that there's a lot of talk in higher ed right now about sort of this isolation crisis, particularly among faculty, let alone students, right? Of just feeling alone in the work that they're doing and very siloed in their work that they're doing. And so when we think about the power of something like play or human-centered design, then we're really trying to tackle that feeling of isolation and signal experimentation together and a shared ownership really of learning. So I think when faculty experience that collectively, it creates a culture shift where innovation becomes something people do together rather than just individually.
Liz, this has been an enriching conversation on the role of play-based learning and experiential education in shaping the future of teaching excellence. Your insights into how curiosity, collaboration, and innovation can transform faculty development truly highlight the evolving nature of education. Thank you for sharing your experiences and perspective on creating learning environments that are more human-centered, engaging, and future-ready. We look forward to seeing how the work of at the Badavas Center continues to inspire new models of teaching and learning across campuses everywhere. On behalf of Business Talk, thank you once again for your time, your clarity, and your generosity in sharing your research. It has been an absolute pleasure to having you today. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much for having me.